Hey everybody, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here, and happy 4th of July to all my fellow Americans. And this one, quite frankly, is in the spirit of independence because we're going to be starting in Ukraine, who is obviously currently fighting to keep theirs. Now, there's a really interesting article from Tom's that I'm cribbing from here, but essentially the era of killer robots is here, and here's what's going on. Ukraine basically is becoming the Silicon Valley for drones, autonomous weaponry, and more. And so their tech industry has begun adapting consumer technology to actually fight their war. They're not just receiving essentially weapons from the United States, NATO allies, etc., to the tune of billions of dollars. They are developing their own. And so the New York Times did an interesting report on this, saying that companies are creating, quote, technology that makes human judgment about targeting and firing increasingly tangential. Now, autonomous systems currently keep a human in the loop to select and confirm targets, and that human in the loop is an oft-used phrase that is used by policymakers and AI ethicists, and basically one fear is that they may not always remain a requirement, meaning human intervention in the targeting system is going away and letting, quite frankly, the robot, AI-backed robot, do it itself. Now, keeping the human in the loop in this case, essentially as it stands right now, especially in the war in Ukraine, means that drone operators wearing modified VR headsets and using game controllers are essentially controlling these robots, like drones, those kinds of things. And so by virtue of that, they're using essentially basic computers like Raspberry Pis, modified consumer drones like DJI drones, et cetera, to achieve this, which means if they can weaponize it there, pretty much anybody can weaponize it because Raspberry Pi and DJI drones and other drone makers are pretty ubiquitous and very easy to get for anybody. So we've all seen drones that can, follow sports, right? Follows the race car down the track, the snowboarder down a mountain, et cetera. It's pretty easy for that to track and follow something in motion. You don't need somebody basically manning that, as it can simply follow along the snowboarder down the mountain. So now it involves taking drones that look similar to like the DJI Mavic Pro and then modifying them so they can use first-person view for combat instead of extreme sports. So here we are. Now, much of the success of these projects is made possible by the widespread availability of consumer technology that can be easily weaponized, something I just talked about. And so they can also leverage machine learning, also commercially available like those used in Apple's detection mode in the iOS accessibility settings that allows you to essentially identify things like doors, steps, and signage, but they are now starting to adapt it in Ukraine to essentially detect enemy tanks, artillery placements, and more. And so here's where we start to get into the realm of terrifying here, because Ukrainian manufacturers like drone companies Vyry and Saker have developed and implemented autonomous targeting systems for their drones that obviously they are giving to the Ukrainian military, I assume selling to the Ukrainian military. Now, a human operator has to select and lock in a target, but then the tracking software takes over from there. And so the Vyry uses basic computer algorithms, but Saker is now relying on deep learning and applying deep learning to these drones, which is a subset of AI learning. Essentially, they're building software that can identify and attack targets autonomously. So in the case of Saker's software, the AI processes were initially designed to sort and classify fruit, but there's a war going on. And so after adapting that software for warfare, Saker began sending prototypes to the front lines for testing with drone pilots. Now, the project works so well that Saker is now mass producing single board computers with its integrated software for these first-person view drones for the Ukrainian defense. Now, the drones are loaded with explosives. They're sent airborne, and once a human operator identifies the target, the drone can now track it and then crash into it basically on its own, obviously exploding itself and ideally exploding the incoming Russian tank or whatever it's tracking. So, videos confirmed by the New York Times show drones hitting Russian targets on the front lines of the war. Saker is now making 1,000 circuit boards each month. They plan to increase production to 9,000 a month by the end of the summer. Now, again, this is all being fueled by necessity. The Ukrainians are fighting for their lives as they literally have a foreign army within their borders, bombing them relentlessly. Quote, Once we reach the point when we don't have enough people, the only solution is to substitute them with robots. That's according to Sacker co-founder Roslav, and he did not want to be identified in any other way due to Russian retaliation. Obviously, the last thing Sacker wants is to lose their leadership and possible production capabilities, as they are critical to the Ukrainian warfighting capability. Now, in another project, the Ukrainian military is developing an autonomous gun turret. Now, they are naming this WALL-E because it looks and resembles the Pixar robot WALL-E. You know, WALL-E, like I'm sure you've seen the movie, right? Now, that turret WALL-E can lock onto a target from up to 1,000 meters away. The operators use a PlayStation controller and a tablet to monitor the system and select targets, and then WALL-E can jump between pre-programmed positions to cover a broad area. Now, interestingly enough, outside of Ukraine, the South Koreans, for years, had been developing more sophisticated autonomy. They're not using off-the-shelf stuff because South Korea's got a lot of excellent electronics development. They were doing this on the basically their side of the DMZ with North Korea, where they would have autonomous machine guns essentially patrol the area. And so, you know, let's say the North Korean army decides to invade at a point, the autonomous guns can turn around and by themselves start opening fire to defend the border against, let's say, the incoming North Koreans. Now, at its heart, going back to Ukraine, WALL-E is possible because the same technology that allows surveillance cameras to identify individuals is essentially what they are integrating here as well. So the app surrounds identified targets with a box, and the operator only needs to pull the trigger on the PlayStation controller to open fire. And that, once again, can become autonomous. So as you start running out of manpower, you basically tell WALL-E, hey, anything within, you know, your sphere of influence that is targetable, that is coming your way, let's say that is dressed like a soldier, or, you know, appears to have the availability of a tank, or looks like a tank rather, the outline of a tank, go ahead and feel free to open fire while, you know, alerting us, you know, sending a radio signal back saying, hey, you know, we're under invasion, I'm opening fire, those kinds of things. That's what we're coming to. But the issue, excuse me, I'm still getting over COVID here. The issue that we have overarchingly, though, is the fact that if we are going autonomous, like all autonomous systems we've seen so far, and even look at basic facial recognition problems we've had here in the United States, to the point where Oakland, San Francisco, and other municipalities have banned facial recognition use by law enforcement, is that it's going to make false positives. In other words, what if WALL-E is patrolling and it sees a whole bunch of Ukrainians that are fleeing for their lives as the Russians are right behind them? Is WALL-E going to not understand the difference between, let's say, a fleeing Ukrainian, you know, civilian versus an armed Russian soldier, and then goes ahead and wipes out the refugees or the escaping, fleeing Ukrainians when it's supposed to be defending them? These are things that we need to understand, in the same way that if a drone mistakes, let's say, a civilian truck that is moving, let's say, critical supplies through a war zone, gets lost or whatever, now is the drone going to blow that up because it mistakes it for, let's say, a Russian troop transport, a tank, whatever it is? So there's a lot that needs to be hammered out here, and the less we have humans in the loop, the more concerned, obviously, you know, the human rights side of this should be. Now, if you're a longtime follower and listener of mine, you know that I am very much pro-Ukraine, you know, in this conflict, to the point where, you know, I've interviewed members of their parliament on my radio show. You can also check them out on my YouTube channel. And so this is something that out of necessity, Ukrainians in a literal fight for their lives are leveraging and using, but it also shows the world just how easy it would be to have a local homegrown terrorist organization buy a DJI drone, buy a Raspberry Pi, and start integrating basic understandings of, you know, even the Apple iOS accessibility feature that will be able to identify doors, windows, etc., and have the drone fly right through a window and blow open a house. These are things that we have to consider, because this example is now being created for the world. And while it's a necessity for Ukraine, it sure can fuel very easy to build terrorism around the world. And so I'll leave you with that. I think this is a very important one that we have to talk about, but quite frankly, as we are going through this, this is going to be the next just generation of problems and violence. And as we are seeing a rising, movement, that is focused on political violence around the world, this becomes that much more troubling. And so here we are. We'll see what happens with this, but quite frankly, I'm not a fan, and we'll see what happens. But as always, I do hope that the Ukrainians prevail. So take it for what it's worth. But autonomous killer robots are, quite frankly, here, and I don't think they're going anywhere. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter, Nick AESP. And please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please attempt to stay private. Thanks, everybody.